Hey guys, welcome back to my channels, or maybe welcome for the first time. Either way, I hope you're somewhere cozy right now. Maybe the lights are dim, maybe you've got tea, maybe you're just scrolling in bed because, let's be real, sleep is harder than it should be. Tonight, we're going to drift, very slowly, into one of the most glamorous, yet honestly miserable jobs in human history. The job of being Pharaoh. Yes, the so-called god kings of ancient Egypt. Spoiler alert, being worshipped like a living deity sounds nice, but it came with some very disturbing fine print. And by fine print, I mean inbreeding, paranoia, murdery siblings, and more eyeliner than a mid-2000s emo band. But don't worry, we're not rushing anywhere. We're just going to glide calmly through a few thousand years of royal awkwardness. So, settle in. Let's start floating down the Nile. Pharaohs, gods with migraines. So, picture this. You're a pharaoh. You're supposedly the son of the sun god Ra, which sounds impressive, except people also think the crops will fail if you sneeze wrong. You're a divine being, but you still get indigestion and toothaches like everyone else. And your entire family is staring at you all the time. Now, the first thing to know about pharaohs is that their family trees were more like family circles. Marrying your sister wasn't just tolerated, it was encouraged. Why? Because apparently the gods loved purity, and nothing says pure than marrying your teenage cousin, or your niece, or sometimes your daughter. Yeah, ancient Egypt basically invented the royal family awkward Thanksgiving dinner. And while the logic was to keep power in the family, the actual result was that many pharaohs had jaws so crooked they could practically open cans with them, and bodies so fragile they probably pulled a muscle just walking up temple stairs. But hey, who needs good genetics when you've got pyramids? Pepi II, the king who refused to grow up. So let's start with one of the earlier oddballs, Pharaoh Pepi II. He came to the throne around 2278 BCE, and he reigned, wait for it, for over 90 years, which makes him the longest reigning monarch in history. Cool, right? Except no, because Pepi became king when he was about 6 years old. Yes, a literal child was in charge of the Egyptian state. Imagine giving a 6-year-old ultimate political power. He probably just wanted more toys and maybe a snack. But the priests were like, "Great, little Pepi, please also oversee irrigation of the Nile." And Pepi, he never really grew out of being a spoiled kid. He apparently had this weird thing where he kept exotic pets. He even had dwarfs and pygmies brought from Africa because he found them amusing, which is uncomfortable. But that was pharaoh logic. If you're divine, everyone else is basically decoration. By the end of his reign, Egypt was falling apart politically, but Pepi was still sitting there in his palace, ancient and probably very wrinkled, insisting he was still the divine boy king. Somewhere, the gods were rolling their eyes. Akhenaten, the pharaoh who invented awkward religion. Now, if we float forward a few centuries, we meet Pharaoh Akhenaten. He ruled in the 14th century BCE. And let's just say he was not your average god king. First of all, he looked unusual. Ancient art usually makes pharaohs look buff and heroic, but Akhenaten is shown with a long face, drooping belly, wide hips, and a very thin neck. Basically, he looked like a wax figure that melted slightly in the sun. Historians still debate what was up with him. Maybe a genetic disorder, maybe just artistic style. Either way, he did not fit the tough guy pharaoh aesthetic. But more importantly, Akhenaten decided he was going to rewrite the entire Egyptian religion. Instead of worshiping hundreds of gods like everyone had done for centuries, he said, nope, one god only, the sun disk, Aten. That's right. Akhenaten invented the world's most unpopular monotheism experiment. He shut down temples. He erased old gods' names from monuments. He basically told the priests of Amen, who had all the money and power, to go get real jobs. Shockingly, people hated this. They did not want to swap cozy old gods for one giant glowing frisbee in the sky. And Akhenaten, he built a whole new capital city just for Aten worship. A city in the middle of the desert, which was about as practical as building a mall in the Sahara. Oh, and his queen was Nefertiti. Yes, the one with the famous bust in museums. She probably carried most of the political competence in the marriage, while Akhenaten played with his sun disk. When Akhenaten died, everyone basically pretended his reign never happened. They smashed his statues, abandoned his city, and went right back to their cozy, polytheistic chaos. So yeah, pharaohs could cancel entire religions, but apparently not for long. Tutankhamun, the boy who couldn't walk straight. And, of course, we can't float through Egypt's royal disasters without mentioning King Tut, the poster child of ancient royalty. You know him. Golden mask, tomb treasures, every museum gift shop has a mug with his face on it. But here's the secret. Tutankhamun's life was tragic and physically miserable. He became pharaoh at around 9, and like all good royal Egyptians, his parents were brother and sister, which meant his body was a genetic nightmare. Modern DNA studies show Tut had a club foot, a cleft palate, and a spine so twisted it made walking painful. He probably couldn't even stand for long. His leg bones were so fragile that he needed canes to move around. Archaeologists found dozens of walking sticks buried in his tomb. Not exactly the image of a mighty god king. He also suffered from malaria, because being divine apparently didn't come with mosquito immunity. Tut died at just 18 or 19. No one really knows how. Maybe infection, maybe just his body giving up under the weight of generations of inbreeding. But here's the kicker. Despite being one of the weakest pharaohs physically, he's the most famous today. All because his tomb stayed hidden long enough for British archaeologists to stumble on it in 1922. So yeah, Tutankhamun, worshipped in life, miserable in body, dead before 20, and now eternally turned into a coffee mug. Royal dentistry, or lack thereof. While we're here, let's pause for a soothing detail about pharaohs. Their teeth. They were terrible. Absolutely terrible. See, Egyptian bread was full of sand and grit from stone ground flour. So even royal bread was like chewing sandpaper. Pharaoh's teeth were worn down to nubs. In fact, one of the common causes of death among older pharaohs. So we left off with King Tut hobbling around with his walking sticks and the constant threat of malaria. Not exactly a glamorous way to be worshipped as a living god. But don't worry, Egypt wasn't done handing us bizarre pharaoh stories. Next up is Ramses II, or as historians like to call him, Ramses the Great, which, yes, is a very self-assigned nickname. He lived in the 13th century BCE, and he basically decided to brand himself like a celebrity before celebrities were a thing. If Beyoncé carved her face on every building in North America, that's about the level of self-promotion we're talking here. Ramses II, Egypt's human Xerox machine. Ramses II wasn't just long-lived. He reigned for about 66 years, which in ancient terms is practically immortal. He lived into his 90s, which made him that cranky grandpa of the Nile who just refused to retire. And while he was alive, he did two main things: build statues of himself and produce children. A lot of them. No one's totally sure how many children Ramses had, but estimates hover around 100. Some say more. Basically, the man populated half the royal court with his offspring. He had dozens of wives, plus countless concubines, because apparently, being a god king also meant treating women like Pokemon cards. Gotta catch 'em all. Here's the fun part. When you have that many kids, you also get dynastic chaos. His sons and grandsons all jostling for position. Imagine 100 royal children showing up at family dinner, all trying to sit closer to dad. It was like a very dusty, ancient version of Succession, except instead of board meetings, there were crocodiles. The ego of Ramses II. Now, Ramses didn't just want to be remembered as the dad of the century. He wanted to be remembered as the pharaoh. He fought battles, built temples, and carved his name into literally everything. Sometimes he even carved over other pharaohs' names just to make it look like he'd build their stuff. Because why not double down on petty graffiti when you're divine? His most famous monument is Abu Simbel, those giant statues of him sitting on a throne, staring at the desert like he's silently judging everyone. Tourists love them, but let's be clear. This wasn't humility. This was Ramses screaming, "Please, never forget me." Mission accomplished, Ramses. The old pharaoh and his aching bones. But even Ramses the Great couldn't escape the reality of royal genetics and ancient healthcare. When his mummy was studied, scientists found severe arthritis, dental abscesses, and hardening of the arteries. By the end, he was probably hobbling around with a cane, looking less like a mighty conqueror and more like someone in desperate need of a heating pad. Which is a nice reminder. Even the greatest pharaoh eventually turns into a very stiff corpse in a museum. The endless parade of royal kids. Let's zoom in on Ramses' children because they give us a perfect example of Egyptian dynastic weirdness. Some of his daughters became his wives, because of course they did. That whole keeping bloodlines pure thing again. Ramses married several of his own daughters, though historians like to debate which ones and how many times. Honestly, it's a family tree shaped like a pretzel. And naturally, when those kids had kids, you got even more tangled knots of cousin marriage. At this point, Egyptian genetics were basically saying, please stop. Royal kids, born spoiled, died early. It wasn't just Ramses. Most pharaohs had children who lived tragic, fragile lives. Royal kids were showered with luxury, but luxury doesn't fix inbreeding. Many of them were sickly, short-lived, or emotionally unstable. Take, for example, Prince Kalmeset, one of Ramses' sons. He was actually considered intelligent, even spiritual. He loved restoring old monuments, which made him kind of the nerdy archaeologist of the family. But being Pharaoh's son also meant living under the crushing weight of expectations. He never became Pharaoh, outlived by his old man. Instead, he just faded away, remembered mostly for being a preservationist in a world obsessed with self-promotion. Meanwhile, other princes probably spent their lives wondering why their dad kept producing new siblings like limited edition collectibles. Cleopatra, the dynasty soap opera. But if Ramses was Egypt's overachiever dad, Cleopatra was Egypt's drama queen. And no, not the one in the movie with Elizabeth Taylor. We're talking about the real Cleopatra, the seventh, the last pharaoh of Egypt, ruling in the 1st century BCE. Cleopatra is famous for her romances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, which makes her sound glamorous. But her family history was one long, exhausting episode of sibling betrayal and awkward family dinners. The Ptolemaic dynasty, Cleopatra's family, was Macedonian Greek, not native Egyptian. They'd been ruling Egypt since Alexander the Great's general, Ptolemy, grabbed it. And they loved one thing: marrying their siblings. By Cleopatra's time, this tradition had turned the Ptolemaics into one of the most dysfunctional families in history. Brothers killed brothers, sisters poisoned sisters. One uncle murdered a cousin in the temple mid-ceremony. It was basically Game of Thrones, but with more eyeliner. And Cleopatra herself? She became co-ruler with her younger brother husband. Yes, brother husband. They didn't get along, which, to be fair, makes sense when your spouse is also your teenage sibling. Eventually, she had him killed in the Nile War with Caesar. So, yeah, family business as usual. Cleopatra's charm versus reality. Now, ancient writers loved to rave about Cleopatra's beauty. Except, it's complicated. Coins with her face on them show a strong nose, a sharp chin, and not exactly supermodel looks. But her real power wasn't beauty. It was charisma, intelligence, a voice that could apparently talk anyone into anything. So while her love affairs with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony make for juicy storytelling, the reality was that Cleopatra was basically trying to keep her dynasty afloat with charm and manipulation. Spoiler, it didn't work. Rome took over anyway. Her death, by snakebite or maybe poison, is one of those stories wrapped in mystery. But the important part? With Cleopatra's end came the final curtain for Egyptian pharaohs. After thousands of years, the god kings were replaced by Roman governors, and the long parade of royal weirdness was over. The family pretzel comes full circle. So what do we have when we step back? From Pepi, the eternal child king, to Akhenaten, the sun disk fanatic, to Tut, hobbling on canes, to Ramses, the human Xerox machine, and finally, Cleopatra, trapped in a dynasty of self-destructive sibling marriages. What we see is that being pharaoh wasn't a golden dream. It was a genetic, emotional, and often physical nightmare. A job that looked divine, but felt human. Too human. Smooth transition time. But don't get too comfortable yet, because Egypt wasn't the only place royals were turning their family trees into tangled knots. If you're still awake, next we'll drift toward another batch of rulers, the medieval European monarchs, The Habsburgs, the ones who turned inbreeding into an Olympic sport. Because if you thought Egypt had weird jawlines, just wait until we meet Charles II of Spain. So, we floated down the Nile. We've seen pharaohs stumble through life with bad teeth, fragile bones, and family trees shaped like tangled necklaces. Now let's drift across the Mediterranean, up into medieval and early modern Europe. Because if you thought Egyptian royals had weird genetics, oh boy, the Habsburgs are about to enter stage left. The Habsburg dynasty is basically the poster child for what happens when keeping power in the family becomes a little too literal. For centuries, they married cousins, nieces, nephews, and occasionally uncles, until their gene pool was less of a pool and more like a very shallow puddle. And the results? Crooked jaws, infertility, mental instability, and the kind of faces that only a mother or maybe a royal court portrait artist could love. Who were the Habsburgs? First things first, who were these people? The Habsburgs started off as a pretty minor noble family in what's now Switzerland. They were smart, ambitious, and somehow very good at playing the royal marriage game. Instead of fighting wars for land, they just married into it. There's even a saying, "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry." That was basically the family motto. Why swing a sword when you can marry your cousin and inherit half of Europe? Over the centuries, the Habsburgs spread their sticky little family branches all over Europe, ruling Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, parts of Italy, the Netherlands, and eventually Spain. At one point, they controlled so much land that the sun literally never set on the Habsburg Empire. But behind all the pomp and pageantry, the family tree was folding in on itself like badly written fan fiction. The Habsburg jaw, genetics say stop. If you've ever seen the Habsburg portrait, you may have noticed something off. The chin, the infamous Habsburg jaw. It was this huge, protruding lower jaw that made their faces look permanently pouty, like they'd just been told they couldn't have dessert. This wasn't just a quirky look. It was the result of generations of inbreeding. Scientists later studied 200 years of Habsburg portraits and confirmed, yes, the jaw deformity really was genetic. It got worse with every cousin marriage. By the 1600s, some Habsburg royals had jaws so misaligned that chewing food was difficult. One king had such trouble speaking clearly that courtiers had to politely guess what he was saying. Imagine being the ruler of half of Europe, but no one can understand your royal decrees because your chin is too big. Charles II of Spain, the family tree's final cry for help. The absolute peak, or really the tragic finale, of Habsburg inbreeding was Charles II of Spain. He ruled in the late 1600s, and he is sometimes called El Hechizado, meaning the bewitched, which sounds dramatic, but honestly, they might as well have called him the genetic warning label. Charles's parents were uncle and niece, and their family had been intermarrying for generations before that. By the time Charles was born, his family tree looked less like a tree and more like a stick. And the results? Crooked jaws, infertility, mental instability, and the kind of faces that only a mother, or maybe a royal court portrait artist, could love. Who were the Habsburgs? First things first, who were these people? The Habsburgs started off as a pretty minor noble family in what's now Switzerland. They were smart, ambitious, and somehow very good at playing the royal marriage game. Instead of fighting wars for land, they just married into it. There's even a saying, "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry." That was basically the family motto. Why swing a sword when you can marry your cousin and inherit half of Europe? Over the centuries, the Habsburgs spread their sticky little family branches all over Europe, ruling Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, parts of Italy, the Netherlands, and eventually Spain. At one point, they controlled so much land that the sun literally never set on the Habsburg Empire. But behind all the pomp and pageantry, the family tree was folding in on itself like badly written fan fiction. Marrying for power, not love, obviously. Now, the Habsburgs didn't inbreed because they thought it was fun. At least, I hope not. They did it for politics. The logic was, if we marry within the family, we don't lose land or titles, which makes sense in the cold, practical way, but it ignored the part where biology eventually rebels. Marrying your niece might guarantee your grandkids will have more health problems than an overworked medieval apothecary could handle. So the Habsburgs just kept doubling down. Brother-sister marriages weren't common in Europe the way they were in Egypt, but uncle-niece and cousin-cousin, totally normal for them. By the 1500s, their marriages were so consanguineous that some of their kids had fewer unique ancestors than the average village goat. Other notable Habsburg train wrecks. Charles II might have been the poster child, but he wasn't the only Habsburg disaster. Philip IV of Spain, Charles's dad, married his niece, Mariana of Austria. She was only 14, he was 44. And their child? Yep, Charles II. Enough said. Joanna of Castilla, better known as Joanna the Mad, she technically wasn't a Habsburg by blood, but married into the family. She had intense jealousy, paranoia, and mental illness, possibly worsened by all the dynastic drama. She once refused to bury her dead husband, dragging his coffin around Spain while kissing it for years. Yes, years. Imagine that royal road trip. Maximilian II married his first cousin Maria of Spain. Their kids had the jaw, the mental issues, and the weak immune systems. It's like each generation was a new episode in the ongoing saga of why you shouldn't marry your cousin. Portraits don't lie. That much. The funny part is, the Habsburg painters tried their best to make the royals look good. After all, if your paycheck depends on not insulting the king, you're not going to paint him drooling on his robe. But even with all the artistic touch-ups, you can still see the infamous jaw, the droopy lips, and the haunted expressions. It's like the artists were politely whispering, "Your Majesty, I did my best, but your DNA is fighting me." The empire cracks. By the late 1600s, the Habsburg dynasty was collapsing under its own weight. Spain lost wars, went bankrupt, and fell behind other European powers. And at the heart of it all was Charles II, barely able to rule, barely able to function. When he finally died childless, his will triggered the War of the Spanish Succession. Basically, Europe's way of saying, okay, the Habsburgs are done. Who gets the leftovers? It was messy. France grabbed a big slice, Austria kept another, and Spain moved on under the Bourbons. So the Habsburg genetic experiment was over in Spain, although the Austrian line kept going a bit longer. But the damage was done. They had become history's cautionary tale about marrying your cousin too many times. Smooth transition time. So, as we drift out of Habsburg territory, what have we learned? Being royalty wasn't a golden dream. Whether in Egypt or Europe, the obsession with purity and power turned family trees into unhealthy loops. And the result was fragile kings, tragic queens, and dynasties collapsing under their own strange biology. But of course, the Habsburgs weren't alone. There were plenty of other royal families who doubled down on weirdness. Next time, we'll float over to the Tudors and Stuarts in England, Families that gave us everything from beheaded wives to sad little princes locked in towers. Because apparently, monarchy is just one long bedtime soap opera. So, we floated past the Pharaohs, drifted through the Habsburgs, and marveled at the fact that genetics can only take so much before waving a white flag. Now, let's quietly sail into England. Because if there's one royal family that managed to be both legendary and incredibly dysfunctional at the same time, it's the Tudors, followed, of course, by the Stuarts, who gave us religious chaos, a few civil wars, and a king who managed to lose his head, quite literally. Let's ease into this with the most famous Tudor of them all, Henry VIII. Henry VIII, England's Renaissance gym bro. Henry VIII is usually remembered as the king with 6 wives, 2 of them beheaded, which already sounds like a reality show too dark for Netflix. But when Henry started out, he wasn't the bloated, gout-ridden monarch we picture. No, young Henry was athletic, charming, tall, and handsome. Basically, he was the Instagram filter version of himself. But then he realized one thing. He needed a son, badly. And nothing sends royals into existential panic quite like the idea of not having a male heir. So Henry started collecting wives like baseball cards. First was Catherine of Aragon, Spanish princess, classy, pious. The marriage lasted 20 years, but Henry decided she wasn't giving him the sons he wanted. They had one surviving child, Mary. And Henry thought, a daughter? That doesn't count. Patriarchy was fun like that. So naturally, Henry asked the Pope for an annulment. The Pope said no, and Henry responded the way any reasonable divine monarch would. He broke England away from the Catholic Church entirely. Because why not double down and invent your own religion when you just want a divorce? The 6 Wives Saga. After Catherine came Anne Boleyn. Clever, ambitious, and absolutely not content with just being Henry's mistress. She wanted a crown. Henry married her. She gave birth to Edward, another daughter. Henry was thrilled. Just kidding, he was furious. Soon, Anne was accused of adultery, treason, and witchcraft, because apparently not producing a son was a crime punishable by execution. She was beheaded in 1536. Next up, Jane Seymour. She finally gave Henry the son he wanted, Edward, but she died soon after childbirth, which in Henry's mind made her the perfect wife, obedient, fertile, and unable to argue anymore. After Jane came Anne of Cleves. This marriage lasted 6 months. Henry annulled it because he found her unattractive, which is ironic considering by then, Henry himself was basically a bloated meatball with ulcers. Then Catherine Howard. She was young, lively, and very, very bad at keeping secrets. She had affairs. Henry, furious, had her executed too. Finally, Catherine Parr. She actually outlived Henry, mostly by being patient, intelligent, and waiting for him to keel over from gout. So, 6 wives later, Henry had one surviving son, Edward, and 2 daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. Congratulations, Henry. All that drama and you still couldn't escape a royal succession crisis. Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I. Siblings at war. After Henry's death, the Tudor soap opera continued. His son Edward VI became king at just 9 years old, which is always a good idea. Kids rule countries so well. Edward was sickly from the start and died at 15. Honestly, he barely had time to ruin England before tuberculosis did it for him. Next was Mary I, Henry's daughter with Catherine of Aragon. Mary was devoutly Catholic, and she decided to roll back her father's religious reforms, which meant burning a few hundred Protestants at the stake. Not exactly great PR. She earned the nickname Bloody Mary, which today is more associated with brunch cocktails than with royal executions. And then came Elizabeth I, the daughter of Anne Boleyn. She was sharp, politically savvy, and very good at avoiding marriage proposals, which, given her family's track record, wise. Elizabeth never married, never had kids, and became known as the Virgin Queen, which made her popular in propaganda, but probably less fun at dinner parties. Elizabeth's reign was a golden age of art, exploration, and Shakespeare writing plays about people stabbing each other. But dynastically speaking, she left no heir, and that meant the Tudors were done. Enter the Stuarts. The Stuarts when drama became political theater. So the crown passed to James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England in 1603. Fun fact, he was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, who'd been executed by Elizabeth. Because nothing says family bonding like having your cousin chop off your mother's head. James fancied himself intellectual and wrote about witchcraft, which was very on brand for the 1600s. But his reign mostly set the stage for chaos. His son, Charles I, took the throne and promptly decided that being king meant he didn't have to listen to Parliament. Spoiler, Parliament disagreed. The result was the English Civil War. On one side, Charles and his supporters, the Royalists. On the other, Parliament and their forces led by Oliver Cromwell. After years of bloody fighting, Charles lost, and in 1649, he became the first English king ever to be executed by his own people. Head chopped off, publicly. That was awkward. Cromwell, the king who wasn't king. For a while, England tried not having a king. They called it the Commonwealth, led by Oliver Cromwell, which sounded very modern, except Cromwell basically ruled like a dictator. He banned theater, banned Christmas celebrations, and generally sucked the joy out of England. Imagine your least fun uncle in charge of an entire country. When Cromwell died, the English people were like, yeah, never mind, bring back the monarchy. So they restored the Stuarts. Charles II, party king. Charles I's son, Charles II, became king in 1660. He was nicknamed the Merry Monarch because he basically turned the Restoration into one long party. He had mistresses, illegitimate kids, and probably more fun than any other king in English history. But fun doesn't equal competence. England faced plagues, fires, and wars during his reign. Still, people mostly remembered him for being entertaining, which was an upgrade from Cromwell's no Christmas, no fun regime. James II, the king nobody wanted. After Charles II came his brother, James II, and James had one fatal flaw. He was openly Catholic in a country that had firmly decided Protestantism was its thing. When James tried to raise his Catholic son as heir, Parliament and much of the nobility panicked. They invited William of Orange, James's own son-in-law, to invade. James fled, and the Glorious Revolution of 1688 handed the crown to William and Mary. No bloodshed, just awkward family betrayal. So much for divine right. Smooth transition time. So, what have we seen in England? Kings marrying 6 wives out of desperation, queens burning people alive for religious drama, civil wars, kings losing heads, and finally a revolution that said, actually, maybe Parliament should matter. The Tudors and Stuarts gave us history's best bedtime drama, but also some of the most dysfunctional family dynamics you could ask for. And next, we'll drift east, because while England was busy chopping heads, Russia was perfecting the art of royal tragedy with the Romanovs. Spoiler, lots of sickly children, mystical advisors, and one very famous Rasputin.
So, we've watched the Tudors chop off heads, the Stuarts lose wars, and the Habsburgs slowly collapse under the weight of their own jawlines. Now, let's float into Russia. Because if you thought European monarchies were dysfunctional, the Romanovs would like to raise you one Rasputin. The Romanovs ruled Russia from 1613 to 1917. That's 300 years of cold winters, palaces with drafty halls, and rulers who couldn't decide if they were saints, tyrants, or just hopelessly unlucky. Spoiler, they ended in one of the most tragic royal implosions in history. But let's not rush. We'll glide in slowly, starting with the basics. Royal kids who were sick, rulers who were moody, and a family line that depended on an unhealthy obsession with mystics. Tsar Peter the Great, the man who couldn't sit still. We'll start with Peter the Great, because he was the Romanov who decided Russia needed to modernize, which in his mind meant shaving everyone's beards, building a fake European city in a swamp, St. Petersburg, and forcing courtiers to stop dressing like medieval wizards. Peter was 6'7", absolutely massive for his time. He had violent mood swings, drank heavily, and enjoyed personally supervising the torture of his enemies, which is not exactly the kind of hobby you put on a dating profile. But Peter also had quirks. He loved shipbuilding, so much so that he traveled to the Netherlands and worked in shipyards disguised as a normal laborer. Imagine being a Dutch carpenter and realizing the giant guy next to you with a crown-shaped hat tan lines is literally the Tsar of Russia. Peter's family life, though, messy. He forced his son Alexei into military life, then accused him of treason when Alexei didn't live up to expectations. Peter had him tortured to death. Yes, tortured. By his own father. Nothing says royal parenting like killing your heir because he's disappointing. So that's Peter. A towering reformer with the side hobby in brutality. Fast forward to Catherine the Great. She wasn't even Russian by birth. She was a German princess who married into the Romanovs. Her husband, Peter III, was, let's say, not exactly king material. He was childish, obsessed with playing toy soldiers, and generally more interested in pretending to be Frederick the Great of Prussia than in ruling Russia. Catherine decided, yeah, no thanks. She staged a coup, had Peter arrested, and shortly after, he mysteriously died, accidentally strangled by guards, officially. Totally not Catherine's idea. Definitely. Once in power, Catherine styled herself as an enlightened empress. She wrote letters with philosophers, expanded Russia's empire, and threw glittering parties. But gossip swirled about her personal life. She had lovers, lots of them, which became exaggerated into wild myths. The most infamous rumor, entirely false, claimed she died in an encounter with a horse, which, to be clear, never happened. but it shows just how much people loved to spread scandal about royals. Her actual death was far more ordinary, a stroke. Still, Catherine became the symbol of Russia's golden age, though her family drama, endless court conspiracies, illegitimate kids, and scheming nobles remained firmly in place. And then, of course, we reach the tragic finale. Nicholas II, the last Tsar, the man who managed to be both painfully earnest and disastrously incompetent at the same time. Nicholas wasn't a monster like some of his ancestors. He was actually gentle, shy, and devoted to his family. But he had one fatal flaw. He was born to rule an empire at the exact moment when monarchies were falling apart, and he had absolutely no political skill. He married Alexandra, a German princess, and they were genuinely in love, which was rare for royals. Together, they had 5 children, 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and one precious son, Alexei. And here is where genetics cursed them again. Alexei inherited hemophilia, a blood disease caused by a mutation passed through European royals thanks to Queen Victoria. Basically, any little bump or cut could kill him. This turned the imperial family into anxious wrecks, desperate for anything that could keep the boy alive. Enter Rasputin, Russia's creepiest babysitter. If there was ever a man designed to make history feel like a fever dream, it's him. Rasputin was a wandering Siberian peasant turned mystic. He had piercing eyes, questionable hygiene, and the uncanny ability to make himself indispensable. When he seemed to ease Alexei's suffering through prayer, or possibly hypnosis, or just placebo, Alexandra became convinced he was heaven sent. Soon, Rasputin had free run of the palace. He drank, he chased women, and gave the Tsarina political advice, which, spoiler, was always terrible. Nobles hated him. Priests hated him. Basically, everyone hated him, except Alexandra, who clung to him like a divine bodyguard. The whispers started, Russia's ruled not by the Tsar, but by a filthy monk, which wasn't entirely wrong. The fall of the Romanovs. World War I sealed their fate. Russia suffered catastrophic losses. Soldiers lacked food, weapons, even boots. The population starved. Nicholas refused to back down, convinced God wanted him to keep fighting. In 1917, revolution finally broke out. Nicholas abdicated. The Romanovs were arrested. The dream of divine Tsars was over. And then came their infamous end in 1918. The family was taken to a basement in Ekaterinburg. Nicholas, Alexandra, their children, even their doctor and servants, all executed by Bolsheviks. A brutal, sudden end to 300 years of Romanov rule. The daughters, wrapped in jewels sewn into their clothes, even survived the
So, We floated through the Pharaohs, waded through the Habsburgs, survived the Tudors and Stuarts, and shivered in the Romanov palaces. Now, it's time for France. France, land of baguettes, berets, and the occasional guillotine. The Bourbons ruled from the late 1500s until the French Revolution, and they perfected the art of being flamboyant, spoiled, and tragically out of touch with reality. Let's start with the sun himself, Louis XIV. Louis XIV, the Sun King and his tiny ego. Louis XIV became king at age 4, basically too young to even crawl, let alone understand monarchy. Naturally, he survived assassination attempts, political intrigue, and the plague. He turned into the longest reigning monarch in European history, ruling for 72 years. Louis loved grandeur. He built Versailles, a palace so large it could fit small villages inside. He wore heels, powdered wigs, and elaborate outfits that would make even today's red carpet look minimal. He wanted everyone to worship him, and they did, at least formally. But Louis also had quirks. He had many mistresses, official and unofficial, because why not? And he carefully documented them. The king kept a roster of favorites, which sounds like a medieval version of a celebrity Instagram account. And then there were his children. Louis fathered a dozen or so legitimate children, plus countless illegitimate ones. Some were married off strategically, some sent to monasteries, and some, well, basically ignored until they were useful politically. Louis XV, lazy but dangerous. Fast forward to Louis XV, Louis XIV's great-grandson. He inherited a massive empire and basically thought, cool, I'll just enjoy my life. And he did. The man loved comfort, mistresses, hunting, and gambling, not so much governing. His health suffered, as did France. Economic problems piled up, wars were lost, and court corruption was rampant. Louis XV fathered a dozen children, several with mistresses, which only added to the courtly drama. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, royal cluelessness. Now, the tragic finale of the Bourbons, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Louis XVI was, well, sweet, but clueless. He liked locksmithing. Seriously, the man spent hours making locks, which is adorable in a tiny workshop. It's less adorable when you're the king of a country spiraling toward revolution. Marie Antoinette, the queen from Austria, got a very bad PR campaign. The people blamed her for everything: France's economic collapse, lavish spending, and even the rumored hoarding of cakes. Let them eat cake, which she almost certainly never said, but history really wanted a scapegoat. They had 4 children. Only one son survived to adulthood, Louis Charles, called Louis XVII. He was imprisoned during the Revolution and died in captivity at age 10. The other children, daughters and a baby, also died or were separated in tragic circumstances. And yes, both Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were executed by guillotine in 1793. A shocking, somber ending to a dynasty that spent centuries building palaces, hosting balls, and ignoring political warning signs. The Bourbon pattern. What's clear with the Bourbons is a pattern that repeats across history. Immense wealth and privilege, fragile children, often sickly or ignored, royals obsessed with image and grandeur, dramatic deaths, often violent or tragic. It's the same rhythm we've seen with Pharaohs, Habsburgs, Tudors, Stuarts, and Romanovs. Royalty, glamorous in theory, exhausting in practice. So, we've seen Pharaohs stumble, Habsburgs drool, Tudors chop, Stuarts lose, Romanovs cry, and Bourbons guillotine. Now it's time to slow down and look at the tiny royals, the children.
Because as history shows, being a prince or princess is not all tiaras and gold. Often, it's misery wrapped in silk. Sickly bodies, emotionally fragile, and trapped in dynasties that valued bloodlines over childhood happiness. Charles II of England, the bewitched child. Remember Charles II of Spain from the Habsburgs? England had a version of tragic royal childhood too. Charles II of England, nicknamed the Merry Monarch, had a childhood shaped by his father's beheading, civil war, and exile. He was sent away from England as a boy to grow up in safety, which meant learning politics in Holland, avoiding assassination, and missing most normal childhood experiences. By the time he returned to England, he was a king in a country still recovering from revolution and plague. So, not exactly the carefree upbringing you'd hope for. The Ptolemaic kids, Cleopatra's dynasty. Back in Egypt, Cleopatra's children didn't have it easy either. Her son Caesarion, Julius Caesar's child, was briefly pharaoh, but once the Romans took over, he was executed. Cleopatra's other kids with Mark Antony, they were sent to Rome, effectively hostages in a foreign court, growing up with tutors and marble halls, but without the warmth of home. Royal children often had wealth and tutors, yes, but emotional security? Rare, especially when survival meant being pawns in dynastic games. Louis XIV's children, Versailles drama. Let's float back to France. Louis XIV, the Sun King, had dozens of children, most of them illegitimate. While some were recognized and given titles, many were ignored, raised in semi-isolation or sent to convents. Even the legitimate children had strict schedules, tutors, and endless etiquette training. Emotional warmth was scarce. Mistresses and politics dominated the court, so being a child at Versailles often meant sitting through long meals, endless prayers, and ceremonial dress while your father carved his image into the palace walls. The sickly royals of Central Europe. Central Europe had its share of tragic children too. Habsburg princes, for instance, were often born with deformities, chronic illness, or cognitive disabilities caused by generations of inbreeding. Take, for example, the Austrian archdukes and archduchesses of the 17th century. Many died before adolescence. Those who survived often had physical or mental impairments, leaving courts to balance dynastic politics with the reality of fragile heirs. Parents, naturally, were more focused on succession than nurturing. Children were taught politics and protocol before they learned to walk properly or speak clearly. Childhood was a training camp for power, and sometimes it was lethal. Scandinavian tragedy, sickly princes. In Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, royal children were similarly vulnerable. Queen Christina of Sweden, for instance, became queen at 6 years old after her father's death. She had tutors, scholars, and endless lessons in governance, religion, and languages. But her personal happiness was sacrificed for duty. By adulthood, she famously abdicated, partly to escape courtly expectations and perhaps to finally live for herself. Her story is one of rare escape. Most royal children never had that choice. Russia's hemophiliac heirs. The Romanovs had Alexei, heir to the throne and famously hemophiliac. Every minor scrape could be fatal. His parents, Nicholas II and Alexandra, lived in constant anxiety. Rasputin became indispensable because he seemed to ease Alexei's suffering. The other Romanov children, though not hemophiliac, were still vulnerable to disease, strict discipline, and the pressures of court life. Playtime was supervised, education was intense, and family life was overshadowed by politics, superstition, and the ever-present shadow of mortality. Childhood in Egypt versus Europe. It's interesting to compare royal childhoods across cultures. Egyptian pharaohs walked with canes, battled disease, and sometimes became king as toddlers. Loved, yes, but expected to be divine symbols above all else. European royals, often sickly, under constant pressure, and trained relentlessly for political duty. Affection existed, but only as a supplement to dynastic needs. In both cases, childhood was rarely carefree. Instead, it was a slow, structured indoctrination into power, often at the cost of happiness, health, and personal development.
Emperor Caligula, Rome's oddball. Let's start with Caligula. He ruled Rome in the 1st century CE and is often remembered as erratic. He allegedly made his horse, Incitatus, a senator. Whether that's true or just exaggerated by history is up for debate, but it perfectly illustrates a key point. Monarchs with absolute power sometimes do things purely to assert, I can. Caligula also reportedly held lavish dinners where guests were forced to watch him gamble, sing, or display odd behavior for hours. He loved shock value, cruelty, and theatrical gestures. Childhood trauma, extreme privilege, and absolute power can really warp a personality. Louis XIV, the Sun King's rituals. Back in France, Louis XIV wasn't just about Versailles and mistresses. He had rituals bordering on obsessive. Every morning, the king's waking process, called the lever, was a public ceremony. Courtiers watched him dress, eat, and begin his day. If you think waking up in your pajamas while someone watches you brush your teeth is awkward, imagine doing it in heels, wigs, and silk with hundreds of nobles taking notes. Louis also reportedly had rituals for his meals, walks, and even personal hygiene. Tiny habits, amplified by power, became court-wide rules. One could argue it was organizational genius, or just an excuse to be extremely controlling. Peter the Great, odd obsessions. Peter the Great, we mentioned before, had his quirks. Beyond shipbuilding and reforms, he had peculiar hobbies. He loved bodily experiments, often forcing nobles to swim in icy rivers or perform tasks in uncomfortable conditions to toughen them up. Peter also collected unusual pets, including exotic animals from his travels. His fascination with foreign objects and strange hobbies sometimes bordered on obsessive. It's a reminder that eccentricity thrives in royal environments, especially when consequences are minimal. Queen Christina of Sweden, a rebel with rituals. Queen Christina, who became ruler at 6, had a fascination with learning, philosophy, and theology. But she also developed highly unusual habits for a monarch. She preferred male attire, smoked tobacco in public, and hosted salons filled with intellectuals rather than courtiers. Her eccentricity wasn't just personal, it influenced her reign. Advisors struggled to reconcile her intellect with her unconventional public image. She eventually abdicated, probably both to escape politics and to live her life on her own terms. Russian Tsars, eccentricity on ice. The Romanovs, too, had quirky habits. Peter the Great we've covered, but later monarchs were equally unusual. Ivan the Terrible reportedly had fits of rage that could last days, during which courtiers hid to avoid being harmed. Nicholas II, gentle as he was, had a habit of retreating into his study with his children and ignoring political crises. He collected stamps and coins obsessively, a quiet escape from the pressures of ruling an empire on the verge of collapse. Even small personal habits could have outsized historical impact when practiced by absolute rulers. Eccentric British royals. England had its share of quirks too. George III, known for his madness, reportedly spent hours talking to trees or conversing with imaginary visitors. Some historians attribute this to porphyria, a blood disorder, but others note that stress, isolation, and royal duty likely amplified eccentric behavior. Queen Victoria had rituals too. She meticulously recorded her day, including what her children ate, wore, and learned. While organized parenting isn't odd today, combined with absolute power, it became a royal form of obsession. Why do monarchs get weird? A pattern emerges. Absolute power, immense wealth, isolation, and endless public scrutiny seem to amplify quirks. Minor obsessions, unusual habits, or strange routines become magnified into legend. Some were benign, collecting art, writing diaries, or obsessing over personal appearance. Others less so. Cruelty, bizarre rituals, or extreme eccentricity. In every case, these habits make monarchs human, but also highlight the strange pressures of ruling. You're not just managing a country, you're managing perception, legacy, family, and history itself. And sometimes, the weight of it all shows in odd little behaviors that get recorded for centuries.
So, we've wandered through quirky monarchs, palace rituals, and eccentric habits. Now let's float into a quieter, sadder world: illness. Because royalty, despite wealth and privilege, was surprisingly vulnerable to disease. Sometimes their crowns couldn't protect them from microbes. Hemophilia, Queen Victoria's legacy. Hemophilia is often called the royal disease. Why? Because Queen Victoria of England carried it and passed it to descendants across Europe. Queen Victoria herself wasn't affected, but her children and grandchildren were. Her son Leopold died young from a minor fall. Her daughters, however, transmitted the disease to Russia, Spain, and Germany. Alexei Romanov, son of Nicholas II and Alexandra, was hemophiliac. His life was a constant balance of fragile health, anxious parents, and mystical interventions. Enter Rasputin, as we discussed. Spanish and German royals also inherited hemophilia, shaping dynastic decisions. Marriages, medical secrecy, and even political alliances were influenced by whether children were sickly or healthy. Hemophilia wasn't just a medical issue. It was a dynastic one, and of course it terrified parents, especially those who were already under immense political pressure. Smallpox and the poxed crowns. Smallpox was another constant threat. Before vaccination, European royals were highly susceptible. Louis XV of France survived smallpox, but many of his relatives didn't. Royal children were sometimes inoculated with variolation, an early form of vaccination, but the process was risky. Russian tsars and their families also faced smallpox outbreaks. Children could die, marriages could be delayed, and political alliances disrupted. Royal families sometimes survived these epidemics, but the fear was ever present. Childhood illnesses weren't just personal tragedies, they threatened succession and national stability. Tuberculosis, the slow poison. Tuberculosis or consumption claimed many young royals. Edward VI of England, son of Henry VIII, died of what is thought to have been tuberculosis at age 15. His death triggered another succession crisis. Across Europe, tuberculosis silently shaped dynasties. Weak heirs, sickly queens, and fragile children could all change the course of history without a single battle being fought. Royal palaces, though luxurious, were often poorly ventilated and crowded. Disease spread quickly, and medicine was primitive. Even the wealthiest families couldn't escape it. Mental illness and royal vulnerability. Disease wasn't always physical.
Mental illness haunted many dynasties. George III of England experienced recurring bouts of madness, likely porphyria or bipolar disorder. His condition affected government decisions and succession planning. Louis XIV's family had various members with cognitive disabilities or emotional instability, partly caused by inbreeding and partly caused by stress. Courts often treated mental illness as scandalous or shameful. Children and heirs were sometimes hidden away, removed from public life, or forced into convents or monasteries. Epidemics and dynastic chaos. Beyond individual illness, epidemics could devastate royal courts. Plague outbreaks in Italy, France, and England wiped out servants, advisors, and sometimes heirs. In Russia, smallpox and measles decimated noble households. Royal children were especially vulnerable, often quarantined for safety, which made childhood even lonelier. Disease shaped history quietly but powerfully. Kings, queens, and heirs could survive wars, rebellions, and intrigue, yet still fall victim to a virus or bacterial infection. It's a humbling reminder that wealth and power couldn't buy immunity. So, we've floated through sickly children, quirky monarchs, and royal diseases. Now it's time to look at how kings, queens, and heirs approached the inevitable, death. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that royals were obsessed with controlling their lives, and that extended to how they exited them. Pharaohs, burial as eternal project. Pharaohs, as we saw earlier, took death very seriously. Tombs were more than graves. They were entire architectural statements. The Great Pyramid of Giza wasn't just for Khufu's body. It was meant to house treasures, food, servants, figurative ones in statues, and even magical spells to ensure the pharaoh's afterlife comfort. Some pharaohs were buried with real servants or animals, because why not? Death was just another logistical problem to manage. The process was elaborate, ritualized, and expensive. Mummies, masks, and labyrinthine chambers ensured that the king remained powerful, even under stone. European funerals. Pageantry over grief. In Europe, royals treated funerals as political theater. Louis XIV had a deathbed surrounded by courtiers who meticulously documented every moment. His body was embalmed, dressed in elaborate regalia, and paraded in ceremonies that lasted days. Henry VIII had his coffin displayed in St. George's Chapel with a wax effigy dressed in crown and robes. The king's body decomposed quietly elsewhere, because even monarchs needed to manage appearances. Royal funerals weren't private. They were spectacles. Mourning was less about emotion and more about demonstrating dynastic continuity, power, and solemn grandeur. Oddities and obsessions. Some monarchs had peculiar burial requests. Peter the Great reportedly wanted to be buried modestly, though his court ignored him and organized an elaborate funeral. Elizabeth I was embalmed, laid in state in a tomb built decades before her death, and essentially staged for eternity. Her tomb includes effigies, coins, and symbols reinforcing her virgin queen persona. Napoleon insisted on traveling coffins and elaborate mausoleums, even long after death. His remains eventually ended up at Les Invalides, in Paris, a monument to imperial ego. Even in death, royals orchestrated their legacy. Public image mattered more than comfort. Tombs in dynastic pride. Royal tombs were also about reminding the living who ruled. Habsburgs in Vienna have a capella filled with hearts, bones, and elaborate decorations. It's essentially a shrine to family survival and obsessive dynastic pride. French Bourbons built chapels, crypts, and monuments in St. Denis, each tomb flaunting lineage, titles, and artistic grandeur. We see a pattern. Royals treated death like another performance, another opportunity to assert influence. Some were grandiose, some were quiet, but all reflected their need to control perception beyond the grave. Smooth transition time. So, as we gently close the final pages of our sleepy history journey, what do we see across time and place? Childhood and genetics shaped heirs' survival and dynastic stability. Eccentricity and obsessive rituals revealed human quirks magnified by power. Disease and mortality were constant, unavoidable, and sometimes decisive. Death and burial became the final stage for asserting authority, identity, and legacy. From pyramids in Egypt to Versailles, Moscow, and St. Denis, royals lived lives of privilege, pressure, and peculiarity. They dazzled, endured, and sometimes died tragically, all while reminding us that history is made not only by battles and laws, but by human fragility, obsession, and occasional absurdity. So, dim the lights, pull the blankets up, and imagine these monarchs quietly resting in tombs, crypts, and mausoleums, still orchestrating legacy, even as we drift to sleep.
So, we've drifted through Pharaohs, Habsburgs, Tudors, Stuarts, Romanovs, Bourbons, sickly children, eccentric habits, diseases, and elaborate funerals. But history is full of smaller, quieter oddities. Minor kings, queens, and heirs whose stories are perfect for slow, sleepy reflection. Because not every royal left massive palaces or historic revolutions. Some were just tragically awkward, excessively quirky, or unlucky. The child kings of Scotland. Scotland had a series of child monarchs whose reigns were brief and mostly supervised by regents. James V became king as a baby, inheriting the throne at only a few days old. His regents tried to manage affairs, but the country was essentially run by advisors. Childhood was a parade of tutors, ceremonial duties, and being propped up as a figurehead. Mary, Queen of Scots, also became queen as an infant. She spent her early years isolated in palaces and under strict supervision. Her life, while full of intrigue later, began in a slow, stifling rhythm of courtly education and ceremonial appearances. These young monarchs never had the chance to experience normal childhoods. Sleepy contemplation of their restricted lives reminds us how dynastic duty shapes lives even before rulers can understand it. Minor German princes. Germany had hundreds of small principalities with princes and princesses who never ruled much, but lived lives of extreme ritual. Many were intensely educated in etiquette, languages, and courtly behavior. Illnesses were common due to inbreeding and cramped castle life. Their deaths often went unremarked outside their tiny territories. These minor royals are easy to overlook, but their lives were just as structured and pressured as kings and queens in bigger countries. The only difference is fewer coronations and more dusty archives. Oddities of love and marriage. Dynastic marriages often created absurd situations. Children were married at young ages for alliances. Sometimes cousins or distant relatives were paired to keep bloodlines pure. Emotional compatibility was rarely considered. Imagine being a 12-year-old princess expected to marry a teenage cousin because some diplomats said it would stabilize borders. Not exactly bedtime fun, but perfect for a sleepy reflection on dynastic pressure. Bizarre superstitions. Many minor royals had peculiar superstitions. Carrying charms to avoid death or illness, consulting astrologers before breakfast, following strict daily rituals to appease unseen spirits. These habits often seem quaint today, but for them, superstition was a daily survival tool, especially for sickly heirs or fragile children. Quiet tragedies. Beyond disease and execution, life for many minor royals was quietly tragic. Childhood deaths were common. Physical disabilities went untreated. Emotional development suffered under constant scrutiny and pressure. Royalty wasn't glamorous for everyone. Behind the glittering gowns and shiny crowns, there was monotony, fear, and the slow erosion of personal freedom. Smooth transition time. So, as we drift toward the end of our long, sleepy journey, it's worth noting history is full of royals whose lives were tragic, odd, or just quietly peculiar. Not all shaped nations. Some were just trapped in ceremonial routines, strange habits, or unlucky circumstances. Next, we'll slowly float through court scandals and minor disasters, small intrigues, odd rivalries, and humorous but tragic situations that didn't make history books prominent but still reflect the slow, peculiar rhythm of royal life. So, we've wandered through pharaohs, sickly children, quirky habits, diseases, funerals, and minor oddities. Now let's float through the quieter, oddly entertaining world of court scandals and petty royal disasters. These aren't revolutions or wars, just awkward, tragic, and sometimes ridiculous situations that reveal the human side of royalty. Mistresses, lovers, and secret romances. Almost every royal court had them. These affairs weren't just for gossip. They shaped politics and family life. France's Louis XV had multiple official mistresses, each carefully documented with children and titles awarded accordingly. Courtiers spent more time watching affairs than attending to state business. Charles II of England, the Merry Monarch, had an endless parade of lovers. His court became a sort of social experiment in scandal management. Peter the Great had relationships that were part political alliance, part personal whim. Romantic entanglements could derail alliances, generate rumors, and create endless paperwork if history were a spreadsheet. It would be full of mistress entries. Sibling rivalries. Dynastic competition often started in childhood and lasted a lifetime. Habsburg children frequently quarreled over inheritances and positions, often escalating into subtle sabotage. Russian Romanov siblings grew up in tightly controlled environments, yet jealousy over parental attention or political favor was inevitable. Even minor princes in Germany and Scandinavia bickered endlessly, though their fights were mostly ceremonial and whispered in palace corridors. Sibling rivalry was a quiet, slow-moving drama that could affect alliances and family cohesion for decades. Ceremonial mishaps. Royal ceremonies were elaborate and disaster-prone. Crowns too large or heavy toppled off heads. Ceremonial robes caught fire from candles. Processions ended in minor injuries, fainting, or public embarrassment. These mishaps were rarely life-threatening, but they humbly reminded royals that grandeur came with risks. Court intrigue and petty plots. Not all political intrigue was revolutionary or violent. Some were absurdly minor. Courtiers would scheme for seating arrangements, banquet positions, or control over minor offices. Nobles sometimes tried to sabotage rivals by spreading gossip or influencing trivial decisions. Occasionally, a minor mishap, like spilling wine on a royal robe, could turn into weeks of court gossip and protocol headaches. History remembers wars and treaties, but the daily minutiae of court life was full of small, sleepy disasters. Financial follies. Monarchs and heirs often managed vast treasuries poorly. Extravagant palace renovations drained coffers. Lavish wardrobes for ceremonies required hundreds of tailors and dozens of shipments of fabric. Dowries and marriage settlements were enormous and sometimes caused disputes between countries. Even when wealth was abundant, mismanagement created tension, minor scandals, and endless paperwork. Smooth transition time. So, as we drift toward our final reflections, we can see that royalty wasn't only about battles, coronations, or grand policy. Much of their lives were slow-moving, oddly tragic, and full of minor disasters. Sibling rivalry, romantic complications, ceremonial mishaps, and financial headaches. Next, we'll float gently into the closing reflections, what all these dynasties tell us about human nature, fragility, and the peculiar rhythms of privilege across history. A soft, sleepy conclusion to our long journey. So, we floated through pharaohs and pyramids, watched Habsburgs drool, seen Tudors and Stuarts struggle, drifted with Romanovs, Bourbons, and minor European princes. We've observed sickly children, quirky habits, diseases, funerals, scandals, and ceremonial mishaps. And now, it's time to slowly close our history book. What have we learned? Wealth and power aren't shields. Royalty often had everything: palaces, treasure, armies, influence. Yet, despite all that, they were fragile. Disease, emotional strain, accidents, and even boredom could shape their lives as much as wars and treaties. Being the king or queen didn't make them invincible. It just meant they had fancier ways to fail. Pharaohs died of illness or political misfortune, European heirs succumbed to smallpox or hemophilia, and monarchs obsessed over rituals that were sometimes meaningless. Their lives remind us that privilege can't guarantee health, happiness, or wisdom. Eccentricity and human nature. Absolute power seems to amplify human quirks. Some monarchs hoarded objects, created bizarre rituals, or developed strange habits. Some were obsessive about appearances, meals, or even daily routines. Others retreated into hobbies, philosophy, or eccentric amusements. We can view these behaviors as funny, tragic, or both. But above all, they humanize figures often remembered only for grandeur, conquest, or political failures. They were people, not just history lessons. Childhood and dynastic pressure. Perhaps the most consistent theme is how childhood shaped dynasties. Sickly heirs, isolated princes, and pressured princesses were common across every continent and century. Education, etiquette, and succession were prioritized over play, emotional development, or freedom. Royal children were training for crowns before they could even walk properly, and sometimes that training failed, leading to fragile rulers, dynastic crises, or tragic early deaths. Death, legacy, and ritual. Death was never simple for royalty. Tombs, funerals, mummies, effigies, and crypts show a preoccupation with legacy, image, and eternity. Even in passing, monarchs sought to control perception. Yet the rituals also remind us that humans crave continuity, ceremony, and meaning, even when life itself is fragile and unpredictable. The gentle irony of history. Throughout all these dynasties, there's a slow, quiet irony. Kings obsessed with power sometimes died before their heirs matured. Children trained to rule sometimes never ruled at all. Wealthy families struggled with diseases common to ordinary people. Monumental efforts, pyramids, palaces, tombs, often outlived the personal ambitions of those who built them. History, in this sense, is both grand and mundanely human. It's full of slow tragedies, quiet oddities, and the gentle absurdity of life under crowns. Final thoughts. As we dim the lights and let this long journey through royalty drift into memory, it's comforting to know that no matter how powerful or privileged, humans across time shared certain vulnerabilities. Fragile bodies, quirky minds, emotional challenges, a desire for recognition, the slow inevitability of mortality. Even kings and queens, emperors and pharaohs were not immune to these rhythms. And that, in the end, is a strangely comforting, sleepy thought. So rest easy. Let the images of pyramids, Versailles, Romanov palaces, and tiny European courts drift past your mind's eye. And imagine the royals quietly, eternally, performing their last ceremonies far from the bustle of history, yet forever preserved in the gentle monotone of stories like these. Sleep well. So, even after exploring Pharaohs, Habsburgs, Tudors, Bourbons, Romanovs, quirky habits, sickly children, diseases, funerals, and court scandals, there's still more. History is full of small, slow, and slightly absurd moments, the minor oddities of royalty that rarely make headlines, but are perfect for gentle reflection. odd pets, and royal companions. Many monarchs had unusual pets. Peter the Great reportedly kept exotic animals, including camels and leopards, in his court. Courtiers had to adapt to the unexpected chaos of a royal zoo. Louis XIV had dogs and horses treated almost like court officials. Some were given tiny beds, meals, and even medals. Pets weren't just companions. They were extensions of royal identity, a way to display wealth, taste, and eccentricity. And sometimes they caused minor disasters in the halls of power. Strange hobbies. Minor hobbies often took absurd forms. Frederick the Great of Prussia loved playing the flute and composing music. His court spent hours enduring performances, sometimes politely, sometimes quietly panicking. Queen Victoria enjoyed collecting watercolors and sending tiny handwritten notes to family members, emphasizing order, etiquette, and a subtle obsession with minutiae. Even leisure reflected ritual, control, and slow-moving obsession. Minor health oddities. Beyond major diseases like hemophilia or smallpox, minor health quirks often defined royal life. Sensitive stomachs led to elaborate diets and constant supervision. Allergies, fainting, and insomnia influenced daily routines. Children and adults alike adapted palace life to cope with fragile constitutions. Wealth could buy comfort, but not always ease from physical limitation. Quieter court mishaps. Servants sometimes mismanaged ceremonial robes, leading to minor embarrassment for royalty. Dining disasters, dropped silverware, spilled wine, could turn into slow, multi-day protocol headaches. Tiny errors in correspondence, etiquette, or seating arrangements occasionally snowballed into weeks of minor court tension. These small mishaps were unexciting in the grand historical narrative, yet they shaped daily life for generations of royals. The gentle irony. Even minor anecdotes reveal the quiet human side of history. Wealth, power, and privilege didn't prevent awkwardness or tragedy. Childhoods were constrained, habits were obsessive, and death rituals were elaborate. Even the smallest misadventures, a spilled cup, a misplaced charm, a misbehaving pet, became part of a slow, long-lasting historical tapestry. History is, in many ways, mundane, repetitive, and quietly ironic, perfect for slow, reflective listening before sleep. Closing drift. As we gently close part 14, it's worth noting, history isn't always about revolutions, battles, or kings who conquered continents. Sometimes it's about the tiny, sleepy details. Pets, hobbies, minor illnesses, sibling rivalry, or ceremonial mishaps. These details make royalty human. They make dynasties relatable. And they give us stories that drift slowly through our minds like shadows of palaces in candlelight.
Rest easy, let the quiet absurdity of kings, queens, and heirs drift past your thoughts, and remember that even the most powerful humans lived with quirks, pressures, and tiny, sleepy disasters, just like everyone else. So, even after 14 parts of Pharaohs, Habsburgs, Tudors, Bourbons, Romanovs, quirky habits, sickly children, diseases, funerals, and court scandals, history still has small, quiet stories to tell, minor anecdotes, footnotes, and tiny tragedies that rarely make textbooks but are perfect for a calm, monotone reflection. Forgotten royals. History tends to remember the famous kings, queens, and emperors, but many minor royals lived slow, uneventful, and slightly tragic lives. Younger sons who never inherited anything, forced to live in smaller castles or convents. Daughters married off for political convenience, rarely seen outside formal ceremonies. Heirs who died young, leaving palaces half-built and hopes unfulfilled. Their lives were mundane in comparison to grand dynastic narratives, but quietly shaped the rhythm of royal courts. Odd collections. Many royals developed unusual collections, cabinets of curiosities filled with bones, shells, and exotic objects, sometimes more impressive to the collector than to anyone else. Miniature libraries with thousands of books cataloged obsessively. Collections of tiny portraits, jewelry, or ceremonial items that were cataloged, rearranged, and sometimes fought over by heirs. These hobbies reveal an obsessive human tendency to organize, preserve, and assert control, even in small, sleepy ways. Odd rituals. Some royal rituals were just peculiar. Waking ceremonies, in which courtiers observed every movement of a king or queen. Dining routines that required elaborate seating charts and repeated toasts. Superstitious acts like walking around a room a certain number of times before meetings or carrying charms to prevent minor illness. These rituals were part etiquette, part superstition, and part pure habit. They built slow, predictable routines in court. Minor tragedies. Even outside wars and epidemics, royal life involved quiet misfortune. Illnesses that didn't kill but left heirs weak or fragile. Childhood isolation and lack of normal play. Fainting, emotional stress, or awkward ceremonies that could be humiliating. Royal life wasn't glamorous for everyone. Behind the gilded walls and ceremonial splendor, there was monotony, fragility, and subtle tragedy. The gentle irony. Across centuries and continents, a pattern emerges. Absolute privilege didn't prevent fragility. Grand palaces couldn't shield from disease, boredom, or minor mishaps. Human quirks, obsessive habits, and small failures were amplified by wealth and power. Even minor footnotes in royal history reveal this slow, quiet irony. The more elaborate the life, the more opportunities for subtle misfortune. Final drift. As we gently close part 15, let's reflect on all we've explored. Royal children, sickly and constrained, struggling under dynastic pressure. Quirky, obsessive rulers shaping courts with rituals and habits. Diseases, funerals, scandals, and minor disasters quietly influencing history. The slow human rhythm behind grandeur, power, and legacy. History is not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's sleepy, mundane, and oddly fascinating. And perhaps that's why these stories are perfect for drifting into a calm, reflective state. A gentle journey through human fragility, quirks, and the peculiarities of privilege. Close your eyes, imagine the shadowed corridors of palaces, pyramids, and castles, and let the quiet absurdity of royal life drift past your thoughts. Sleep well. So, even after 14 parts of Pharaohs, Habsburgs, Tudors, Bourbons, Romanovs, quirky habits, sickly children, diseases, funerals, and court scandals, history still has small, quiet stories to tell. Minor anecdotes, footnotes, and tiny tragedies that rarely make textbooks but are perfect for a calm, monotone reflection. Forgotten royals. History tends to remember the famous kings, queens, and emperors, but many minor royals lived slow, uneventful, and slightly tragic lives. Younger sons who never inherited anything, forced to live in smaller castles or convents. Daughters married off for political convenience, rarely seen outside formal ceremonies. Heirs who died young, leaving palaces half-built and hopes unfulfilled. Their lives were mundane in comparison to grand dynastic narratives, but quietly shaped the rhythm of royal courts. Odd collections. Many royals developed unusual collections, cabinets of curiosities filled with bones, shells, and exotic objects, sometimes more impressive to the collector than to anyone else. Miniature libraries with thousands of books cataloged obsessively. Collections of tiny portraits, jewelry, or ceremonial items that were cataloged, rearranged, and sometimes fought over by heirs. These hobbies reveal an obsessive human tendency to organize, preserve, and assert control, even in small, sleepy ways. Odd rituals. Some royal rituals were just peculiar. Waking ceremonies, in which courtiers observed every movement of a king or queen. Dining routines that required elaborate seating charts and repeated toasts. Superstitious acts like walking around a room a certain number of times before meetings or carrying charms to prevent minor illness. These rituals were part etiquette, part superstition, and part pure habit. They built slow, predictable routines in court. Minor tragedies. Even outside wars and epidemics, royal life involved quiet misfortune. Illnesses that didn't kill but left heirs weak or fragile. Childhood isolation and lack of normal play. Fainting, emotional stress, or awkward ceremonies that could be humiliating. Royal life wasn't glamorous for everyone. Behind the gilded walls and ceremonial splendor, there was monotony, fragility, and subtle tragedy. The gentle irony. Across centuries and continents, a pattern emerges. Absolute privilege didn't prevent fragility. Grand palaces couldn't shield from disease, boredom, or minor mishaps. Human quirks, obsessive habits, and small failures were amplified by wealth and power. Even minor footnotes in royal history reveal this slow, quiet irony. The more elaborate the life, the more opportunities for subtle misfortune. Final drift. As we gently close part 15, let's reflect on all we've explored. Royal children, sickly and constrained, struggling under dynastic pressure. Quirky, obsessive rulers shaping courts with rituals and habits. Diseases, funerals, scandals, and minor disasters quietly influencing history. The slow human rhythm behind grandeur, power, and legacy. History is not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's sleepy, mundane, and oddly fascinating. And perhaps that's why these stories are perfect for drifting into a calm, reflective state. A gentle journey through human fragility, quirks, and the peculiarities of privilege. Close your eyes, imagine the shadowed corridors of palaces, pyramids, and castles, and let the quiet absurdity of royal life drift past your thoughts. Sleep well. Even after 15 parts exploring Pharaohs, Habsburgs, Tudors, Bourbons, Romanovs, eccentric habits, sickly children, diseases, funerals, and court scandals, history still has small, quiet moments tucked away. These are the minor details, forgotten anecdotes, and tiny quirks of royalty that rarely make textbooks, but are perfect for a gentle bedtime drift. Forgotten heirs. Not every child in royal families made history. Many were largely invisible. Second or third sons who were trained for military or church careers, but never actually ruled. Daughters sent off to minor European courts for political marriages, children who died young. Sometimes their passing went almost unnoticed outside the palace. These forgotten royals lived quiet, constrained, and oddly tragic lives. They weren't celebrated in history books, but their stories echo the slow monotony of palace life. Odd collections and obsessions. Many royals had curious hobbies. Miniature gardens inside palaces, tended obsessively by a few dedicated servants. Cabinets of curiosity filled with shells, bones, coins, or exotic objects. Personal libraries cataloged with extreme care, sometimes dozens of copies of the same book for symmetry. Even in leisure, royalty's obsessions were amplified by wealth and boredom, revealing human eccentricity at its quietest. Rituals that made sense, sort of. Court rituals were elaborate and sometimes absurd. Morning routines observed by dozens of courtiers, noting how each handkerchief was folded or robe draped. Dining arrangements that required precise positioning and repeated ceremonial gestures. Charm carrying, superstition, or unusual habits to avoid minor illnesses or misfortune. For ordinary people, these might seem silly. For royals, they were necessary tools to manage power, perception, and anxiety. Quiet mishaps. Royal life wasn't free from accidents or embarrassment. Spilled wine, misaligned robes, or fainting in ceremonies could generate weeks of gossip. Pets, from dogs to leopards, sometimes caused chaos in the halls. Minor injuries or illness were magnified because the royal body represented the dynasty. These small, sleepy disasters remind us that privilege didn't make life easy. The gentle irony. Across continents and centuries, a consistent pattern emerges. Absolute power amplified quirks and eccentricities. Rituals, obsessions, and minutiae defined daily life more than wars or decrees. Small misfortunes and minor disasters quietly shaped dynastic outcomes. Even minor footnotes in royal history reveal the slow, quiet irony of privilege. The higher the status, the more ceremonial, obsessive, and fragile daily life could be. Final drift. As we close part 16, it's worth reflecting. Royal life, from pharaohs to minor princes, was slow, constrained, and filled with tiny dramas, quiet tragedies, and peculiar routines. These small details, often overlooked, offer a gentle window into human fragility, obsession, and the quiet absurdity of power. So, as the candles of history flicker and the shadows of palace corridors drift past your mind, allow these sleepy stories of royalty to lull you into calm reflection. Sleep well. Even after 15 parts of pharaohs, European dynasties, quirky habits, sickly children, diseases, funerals, and court scandals, history still has small, quiet stories tucked away. These are the minor anecdotes, forgotten rituals, and tiny quirks of royalty that rarely make textbooks but are perfect for gentle reflection. Obscure monarchs. Some royals were famous for doing very little. Minor German princes who ruled tiny principalities but never made significant policy decisions. Their daily lives were mostly ceremonial, full of protocol and often repetitive. Forgotten queens married into foreign courts with little influence. They attended endless ceremonies in supervised households, while historical memory largely ignored them. These quiet lives remind us that not all monarchy was action-packed. Sometimes it was slow, repetitive, and a little tedious. Bizarre hobbies. Royal hobbies often veered into the peculiar. Miniature battles. Some princes staged tiny military exercises in their gardens. Exotic collections, shells, bones, stuffed animals, and curiosities lined palace shelves. Obsessive cataloging. Books, coins, and even cutlery were meticulously counted, rearranged, and preserved. Even leisure could be structured, ceremonial, and a little obsessive. Superstitions and rituals. Superstition ran quietly but deeply through royal life, carrying lucky charms to avoid minor accidents, consulting astrologers before meetings, journeys, or meals, morning routines observed by dozens of attendants to ensure perfection. It might seem excessive today, but for royals, ritual and superstition were part of managing stress, image, and tiny uncertainties. Everyday mishaps. Not all disasters were dramatic. Minor mishaps were common. Fainting during ceremonies from stress or illness, spilled wine or broken dishes triggering weeks of gossip, pets running amok in palace halls causing minor chaos. These slow, sleepy misadventures remind us that privilege didn't shield royalty from everyday human blunders. Quiet irony. Across centuries and continents, a pattern appears. Absolute privilege amplified quirks and eccentricities. Daily life was shaped more by small routines than grand battles. Minor misfortunes quietly influenced dynastic decisions and personal reputation. Even the smallest, sleepiest details of royal life reveal the slow irony of power. The higher the status, the more ceremonial, obsessive, and delicate life could be. Closing drift. As we gently close part 16, it's comforting to note that royal life, from pharaohs to minor European princes, was full of quiet drama, tiny disasters, peculiar routines, and human fragility. So, imagine the flickering candlelight in palace corridors, the soft shuffle of attendants, and the gentle echo of ceremonial footsteps. Let these slow, sleepy stories drift past your mind as you relax into the calm rhythm of history. Sleep well.
Even after 16 parts covering pharaohs, European dynasties, quirky habits, sickly children, diseases, funerals, scandals, and minor mishaps, there are still small, quiet stories tucked away in history. These are the minor anecdotes, forgotten rituals, and peculiar quirks of royalty that rarely make headlines, but are perfect for a gentle bedtime drift. Lesser-known royals. Not every monarch achieved fame or influence. Youngest sons and daughters often lived constrained, ceremonial lives without political power. Minor princes in small German or Italian principalities attended endless ceremonies, maintained precise routines, and rarely left a historical footprint. Obscure queens married into distant courts and spent lifetimes supervising households, educating children, and performing rituals, all largely unnoticed by history. These lives were slow, repetitive, and sometimes tragically unremarkable, perfect for our sleepy exploration. Curious collections. Royal hobbies often lean toward the unusual. Exotic animals housed in palace courtyards, sometimes causing chaos among courtiers. Cabinets of curiosities filled with shells, bones, coins, or strange artifacts. Obsessive cataloging of books, jewelry, and ceremonial items, sometimes arranged by color, size, or symmetry. Even leisure reflected control, obsession, and the quiet eccentricity of privilege. Quiet rituals. Superstition and routine shaped daily royal life. Morning inspections by dozens of attendants, ensuring correct folding of robes or placement of handkerchiefs. Carrying charms, consulting astrologers, and following complex routines to avoid minor accidents or illness. Dining arrangements and ceremonial gestures that had to be repeated perfectly to maintain appearances. These rituals might seem excessive, but they helped manage stress, hierarchy, and dynastic image. Minor mishaps. Not all royal disasters were dramatic. Fainting during public appearances due to illness, stress, or heavy clothing. Pets disrupting ceremonies, knocking over items, or frightening servants. Small accidents, like spilled wine or broken dishes, occasionally escalating into weeks of court gossip. These subtle mishaps remind us that even privilege can't remove life's small challenges. Gentle irony. Across centuries, a pattern emerges. Absolute privilege amplified quirks and eccentricities. Daily life revolved more around routines, rituals, and minor mishaps than wars or politics. Quiet, sleepy disasters shaped dynastic outcomes and personal reputation, sometimes more than grand events. Even the tiniest footnotes of royal history revealed the slow irony of wealth and power. The higher the status, the more ceremonial, delicate, and fragile life could be. Final drift. As we gently close part 17, let's reflect. Royal life,
From pharaohs to minor European princes was a mixture of quiet drama, small disasters, peculiar routines, and human fragility. Imagine candlelit corridors, softly echoing footsteps, attentive servants, and the gentle shuffle of ceremonial robes. Let these slow, sleepy stories drift past your mind as you relax and drift toward calm reflection on the human side of history. Sleep well.
Even after 17 parts of pharaohs, European dynasties, eccentric habits, sickly children, diseases, funerals, court scandals, and minor mishaps, history still has quiet, overlooked stories. These are the forgotten whispers of royalty. Small, sleepy tales that rarely make textbooks, but add texture to our journey. Obscure royals. Some royals lived almost entirely unnoticed. Third or fourth children of powerful dynasties who spent lives attending ceremonies, maintaining households, and performing minor duties. Queens married into distant courts, largely confined to etiquette and supervising domestic matters. Heirs who died in infancy left palaces half prepared and hopes unfulfilled, their lives recorded only in dusty archives. These lives were quiet, repetitive, and oddly tragic, perfect for slow reflection. Peculiar collections. Many royals had unusual hobbies. Miniature gardens tended obsessively, sometimes in strict geometric patterns. Cabinets of curiosities containing shells, bones, exotic objects, or oddly arranged trinkets. Obsessive cataloging of books, coins, cutlery, or ceremonial items, often arranged with painstaking precision. Even in leisure, these hobbies reflected control, obsession, and the subtle oddity of wealth. Subtle rituals. Daily royal life relied heavily on routine and superstition. Morning rituals monitored by dozens of attendants, ensuring everything was perfect. Charms, astrologers, and ceremonial gestures to avoid minor mishaps or illness. Dining arrangements and formal gestures repeated precisely, sometimes for hours. For royals, ritual was not just habit, it was a tool to manage stress, hierarchy, and image. Everyday mishaps. Life in palace corridors wasn't without minor chaos. Fainting during ceremonies due to illness, stress, or heavy clothing. Pets, dogs, monkeys, or even exotic animals disrupting routines. Small accidents, like spilled wine or broken porcelain, escalating into slow, weeks-long gossip. These minor disasters remind us that even privilege could remove everyday human vulnerability. Subtle irony. Across centuries and continents, a pattern is clear. Absolute privilege amplified quirks and eccentricities. Daily life revolved more around minor routines than battles or politics. Subtle mishaps quietly shaped dynastic outcomes and personal reputation. Even the tiniest details in royal history reveal a slow, quiet irony. The more wealth and power, the more ceremonial, delicate, and fragile life could be.
Even after 18 parts covering pharaohs, European dynasties, quirky habits, sickly children, diseases, funerals, court scandals, minor mishaps, and obscure anecdotes, history still whispers small, almost invisible stories. These are the minor details, sleepy curiosities, and overlooked royal footnotes that are perfect for gentle bedtime reflection. Forgotten royals. Some members of royal families barely registered in historical memory. Youngest children of dynasties, trained for ceremonial or religious roles, but never wielding real power.
Queens married into foreign courts, performing endless domestic and ceremonial duties while leaving little mark on broader history. Heirs who died young, leaving palaces half-prepared and ambitions unfulfilled, remembered only in archival records. Their slow, repetitive lives remind us that royal existence wasn't always grand. Often it was mundane, ceremonial, and oddly melancholy. Curious hobbies. Royal hobbies could be surprisingly eccentric. Miniature gardens designed and tended obsessively, sometimes following geometric perfection. Cabinets of curiosities filled with shells, bones, exotic artifacts, and tiny trinkets. Obsession with cataloging, books, coins, cutlery, ceremonial objects, often arranged with precise attention to detail. Even leisure reflected control, ritual, and subtle human oddity. Gentle rituals. Daily life for royalty relied heavily on routine and superstition. Morning inspections by attendants to ensure robes, handkerchiefs, and chairs were perfectly arranged. Use of charms or consulting astrologers to prevent minor accidents or illnesses. Dining arrangements and ceremonial gestures repeated precisely, sometimes over long periods. Rituals weren't mere habit, they helped manage stress, hierarchy, and the appearance of order. Minor mishaps. Even small incidents could ripple through royal life. Fainting during ceremonies due to illness, exhaustion, or heavy garments. Pets causing chaos in halls. Dogs, monkeys, even exotic animals occasionally disrupting routines. Spilled wine or broken porcelain escalating into extended gossip or minor protocol headaches. Privilege didn't eliminate small accidents or human vulnerability. Quiet irony. A consistent pattern emerges across centuries. Absolute privilege magnified quirks and eccentricities. Daily life centered more on routines, rituals, and minor mishaps than on wars or politics. Tiny, sleepy disasters quietly shaped dynastic outcomes and personal reputations. Even the smallest historical footnotes revealed the slow, quiet irony of wealth and power. Life at the top could be delicate, ceremonial, and surprisingly fragile. Even after 19 parts of pharaohs, European dynasties, eccentric habits, sickly children, diseases, funerals, court scandals, minor mishaps, and obscure anecdotes, history still whispers small, almost invisible stories. These are the minor details, sleepy curiosities, and forgotten footnotes of royalty, ideal for a slow, reflective drift into calm. Forgotten royals. Not every royal left a mark in history books. Younger children of dynasties, trained for ceremonial, military, or religious roles, but never wielding real power. Queens married into distant courts, performing endless domestic and ceremonial duties while leaving little historical trace. Heirs who died young, leaving ambitious palaces incomplete and dynastic plans unfulfilled, quietly recorded in archives. These lives were slow, repetitive, and sometimes quietly tragic, the mundane side of royalty. Peculiar hobbies. Royal hobbies could be unexpectedly eccentric. Miniature gardens
tended obsessively, sometimes in precise geometric patterns. Cabinets of curiosities filled with shells, bones, coins, or tiny artifacts. Obsessive cataloging, often books, jewelry, or ceremonial objects, arranged meticulously by size, color, or order. Even leisure reflected control, ritual, and the subtle quirks of privilege. Gentle irony. Across centuries and continents, a subtle pattern emerges. Absolute privilege magnified quirks and eccentricities. Daily life revolved more around routines, rituals, and minor mishaps than wars or politics. Quiet, sleepy disasters quietly shaped dynastic outcomes and personal reputations. Even the smallest details in royal history reveal a slow, quiet irony. The higher the status, the more ceremonial, delicate, and fragile life could be. Closing drift. As we close part 20, imagine candlelit corridors, echoing footsteps, and ceremonial robes softly rustling. Let these minor, sleepy stories of obscure royals drift past your thoughts, reflecting on the subtle absurdities, quiet fragility, and gentle rhythms of royal life. Sleep well.